let us know when you want us to start. Julie, Julie, your camera is not in the middle. We can only see half your face. Yeah, that's better.
Good morning and a very warm welcome to Session 2 of Women's Study Center's Certificate Course Module on Interrogating Science from the Lens of the Feminist Science Studies. We are extremely honored to have with us Dr. Chayanika Shah, who will be conducting the session today. Dr. Chayanika Shah is a teacher, educator, and gender studies researcher based in Mumbai. She has taught physics to undergraduate students for more than 2 decades. Her work since retiring voluntarily in 2008 has mainly revolved around feminist studies of science, science education, sexuality, and gender studies. In this period, she has co authored 2 books: No Outlaws in the Gender Galaxy and Space, Segregation, Discrimination: The Politics of Space in Institutions of Higher Education. The topic for today's session is Science is Gendered. Let's see how. I would now like to invite Dr. Chayanika to take it forward.
Thank you, Julian. Is it possible for any of you to leave your videos on? If it is, then please try and do that. Because I'm not really used to this online teaching yet. And so some response, and I'm not using so much of visual material. So I'd like to see some faces and get some responses. And I asked briefly earlier, how did the session go? And I believe, I'm sure that Shantan has done a lot of things. So I'm not going to be very structured in my conversation. So please interject and ask me whenever you want to stop me. But I wanted to get a little bit of an idea as to where you are in terms of, how you understand the topic. Also, since not many of you are from sciences, you've done science maybe till class 12 or class 10. So a little bit of background around that would be useful to take this conversation forward from where Shantan left it. So I just wanted to understand that when you see science is gendered, what is, maybe 3 or 4 people can say, what do they think? What does it mean? When we say science is gendered, what does it really mean? Or if Shantan spoke more about objectivity, then what do you understand about objectivity of science as of now? Or even if you just want to start with, what are the points that stayed in your mind from Shantan's talk? Any of these, wherever you want to.
Feel free to unmute students. Takeaway points from the last session that you have in mind.
Ma'am, so when we were discussing, we started off our discussion by kind of how we categorize things, and we drew parallel between how is men different from women, and then we saw within the animal kingdom, the categories or the distinct markers that we've used to define men and women, they're not really probable, because there are exceptions that exist in that world. So they very well focused on that it's us who make these distinctions, it is us who make these categories, wherein science really does not have any these characteristics, but to suit our needs only, and from wherever we are coming, we categorize, this is normal and this is not normal. This is supposed to be men's characteristics and this is supposed to be a women's characteristic. So it focused more about objectivity, and then we went on to further discuss about the theories that some of these scholars' work. We also discussed that how they have objected to this entire idea of this is supposed to be men, this is supposed to be women.
Anyone else wants to add anything? Any thoughts that have come to you after also?
He also showed some. Remember Shantan also showed clips. So anything that you found particularly useful? from those clips.
Okay, we can come back to it later. So I was trying to see when I put the title Science is Gender, let's look at how. I think that, this debate has been going on for a long time. And I remember, like some of you said in the beginning, one of you said in the beginning, way back in 2004 or something, I had a discussion with this college here. There was a workshop that was being organized, and we were talking of science as culture. And in that, when I stood up to speak of feminist critiques of science, the students reacted very badly. The first response was, "Oh, you want to bring feminism to this too," right? So it was at that level. And even before hearing me out, their first reaction was this. And for me, that was very educative. And this was a set of students who were obviously coming from science as well. Very educative to understand that there is a notion of science that many of us carry, particularly those of us who study science carry this notion within our heads, that this is beyond reproach. 2004 to 22 is a long time, maybe your lifetimes, many of you. So this period has made a lot of difference in how we look at science. And there are multiple reasons why this has happened. Some of it is, of course, because of the kind of work that people have been doing over the years in interrogating science from various angles. But it is also about what impacts are we seeing from science and of science in our ways of looking at the world. So that's one anecdote I wanted to remind you. And the second, I remember another place where a different set of students, when the first time we were teaching a course on feminist science studies, this was in TIS, and it was to women's studies students. It was their first semester course. So they're getting acquainted to feminism and science. And this course I co-taught with Geeta Chadda. And when we began the course, almost everybody who was in that classroom, we did this word exercise, what comes to your mind when you think about science, and they all wrote what they had to say. And for most of them, it was, science is boring, science is very deterministic, science is very rigid, science is very whatever. And, there were a lot of things that they said which showed that they did not like science as one thing, but they were critical of science. And that critique came from a place of having studied or understood science from either the classroom or from what is spoken of science outside. And at that moment, I remember that we changed our plan for the course, and I interjected a section to talk about science as I understand it. Because I feel that there is something in science which is also very fascinating. While we do the critique, that fascination has to be understood as well, right? So what I'll try to do today is, of course, in this 1 hour, we can't do much of that fascination, but I want to bring that to the table, that there is something about science which draws us to it and draws us. Who is this us also, I will say eventually. It's not only people who are in power. It's the marginalized also who keep going back to science, for answers. And this is why do we keep going back to science for answers? And how is science used by those in power? Both are parallel questions for us. And if we understand science in this manner, then maybe we get a better understanding of what science is. So these are just two anecdotes to tell you where I'm coming from. Where I'm coming from as somebody who's fascinated by science till date, as well as somebody who's critical of science, very critical of science. And that critique has come from my own experience of doing science as a researcher. Very little. I did only my PhD and I did not continue in research in science, but I taught science for a long time. And so science education has given me a critique. My various actions with various groups which involved interrogating science, whether it was the environment movement, whether it was the health movement, it is from these action-oriented work that I came to a critique of science. So all of this is informing my understanding of what we say today as feminist studies of science. Now, women in physics have done they've done these studies across the world as to why there are so few women in science, right? In physics in particular. And these studies have been done over the last 2 decades or 2.5 decades. Because women in STEM is something that is being encouraged all the time. You're trying to get more and more women. All of us are aware that the number of women is very low in the sciences. And in different sciences, so physics is the top where there are minimum number of women. And as you go along to different disciplines, you may find more women. But physics is something that stays as a discipline that women do not enter. And so then there's this question of why don't women come in? And initially, the whole argument was that it is, the career graph within science is such that women's social responsibilities do not match with that career graph. And so women are not there in physics. This is one angle that was pursued for a very long time. Till when people realized from within sciences and from those who left research in science, talking to them, that actually the question is not about society alone. That's one of the questions. That society does not allow the familial roles and responsibilities that women have to take, does not allow them to achieve high career growth anywhere, particularly in science, because that's the nature of the career growth. The second thing that they came to was that in science, the praxis is such, the way the institutions are made, the way careers are decided, the way hiring is done, the way citation is done, the way grant making is done, all of this is, so it's about the practice of science that makes science really more masculine or more accessible to men, is what was the second level of analysis. What many of us who are coming to feminist science studies are talking about is not only the praxis, but interrogating praxis, yes, but also looking at nature of knowledges. What is it that science is doing in its knowledge that is creating this exclusion? That's the question, right? So the question is, what is the praxis which creates the exclusions? Why? Why are there no women? And it's not only women. If you look at the demography of who is doing science, who would it be? In how many ways can you define this set of people who are doing science? Answers? Anybody? Who are the scientists? Who are the people who are doing science? Whatever is meant by doing science. Anyone? Is it a pattern to call out names and ask?
You could try that.
I feel hesitant, but...
Yeah, they're typing in the chat.
Okay, yeah, that's good enough. Yes, upper class and upper caste men. Anything else? There are men from dominant castes for sure. May not be dominant class every time. Wonderful, able-bodied men or abled men. Anything else? Are they also heterosexist usually? Heterosexual rather, not heterosexist. Heterosexual is very important.
They're usually heterosexual.
So if they're not,
men.
If they're not, they're usually closeted. Yes, very important. Coming from largely urban areas, very, very critical. And they're cis men. They're cis men. We see very few trans people. We see very, very few trans people in the practice of science. And here we may say dominant caste, If we look at the world as such, then it's white cis het men, able-bodied men. That's the category that is doing it, which is wonderful. So they're privileged socially and economically, because it is, as we said, that it is a pursuit that requires a lot of social capital. It requires a lot of socio-economic capital, and whoever has it does it. So this is the demography. So the question is that this is not representative of populations. This demography is a minority in the populations. There are many of us outside of this. And so the question is, why are so many people out of this? Why? What is it that is pushing all these people out? What is it that encourages this set of people to come to science? And what does it do? So this is question number one that we're trying to grapple with. And most people grapple with this question. Whenever you are an outlier in a discipline, one of the first questions that you ask is, why? Why are we not here? That's the first question. And so I just want to read a small little passage from this journalist, Ed Yong, who wrote on what even counts as science writing anymore. They were writing in the context of the pandemic, and they were looking at science in the times of the pandemic. And so they said this, and this I'm sure that you agree after your last session in particular. Science is often caricatured as a purely empirical and objective pursuit. But in reality, a scientist's interpretation of the world is influenced by the data she collects, which are influenced by the experiments she designs, which are influenced by the questions she thinks to ask, which are influenced by her identity, her values, her predecessors, her imagination. I think that is very crucial. Who is it that is doing is very crucial, because the questions that they ask, the ways in which they think, the ways in which their imaginations work, the histories they carry with them, the experiences they carry with them, all of this is critical to knowledge making. Now, this is a statement that I think can be made in public in 2022. It could not have been made in 1990. It is this is what we're saying, that the critical understanding of science has moved in the last 30, 40 years in this manner because of the way in which science has gotten embroiled in our lives and the ways in which we are experiencing the effects of science around us. So the pandemic was a very good example where we relied on science a lot. We relied on science a lot, but we also did not, that there are all the complications of whether it is the pharmaceutical industries, whether it is the chemical bioweapons that are being used, whether somebody is giving information, not giving information, this is right information, wrong information. All of those were questions that all of us were struggling with. And so we're looking at science very differently today. So now, when all these sections of people are excluded from science, their questions are, one, where are we? Second, why are we not there? The third question is, what is it that science says about us? And fourth question is, how does science itself contribute to maintaining the status quo? I think that this third and fourth questions is what we are more looking at, because definitely there are ways in which exclusions happen. What we're looking at is, what does science actually do? What does it say about us? And I remember this is one of the first questions that women asked. So we have different bodies. This is the understanding that we have, that men and women have different bodies. Are there inherent characteristics because of the biology that we come with? This is a question that is very natural to be asked. That this difference, does it lead to a certain kind of characteristic? And so I could go to science to find an answer whether the biology is linked to my expression, whether the biology is linked to some characteristic which can be termed as, this is feminine and this is masculine. And sure enough, science gave us such answers. Science gave us such answers that, yes, that emotion is feminine and objectivity or reason is masculine. So there is an understanding within science, or science did a lot of studies about brain size and intelligence. So is having a, who is more intelligent? If intelligence is determined by the mind, the material object for the mind is the brain. So then can the brain size determine whether the person is more intelligent or not? This is a question that a scientist asks. It's a question that can be asked. It's a question that we can find answers within science also. The point that one would make today is, why would one ask such a question? Why would one link the size of the brain to intelligence? Is it because men have larger heads than women? Is it because certain races have larger heads? Did they take back those questions because they realized that this was not going the right way? There are wonderful stories on this, and these are real experiments that have been done. If you read Stephen Jay Gould, you'll get many such stories. And in biology, we have many more such stories. Unfortunately, I'm not a biologist, so I don't have that kind of anecdotes to tell you. But there is a lot of work that was done on intelligence and brain size. And it was racist understandings that actually, it was gendered understanding which led them to that study. And it is racist understanding that forced them to take it back. Right? Because the people who have larger heads are not the white people. Exactly, in the world. Right? So, as you say, it is racism within science, which it is gendering of science, it is patriarchy within science, which forces it to ask certain questions, and it is racism in science, which forces it to take back those questions or take back those studies and say that no, these are not all right. So there are many, many such examples that we can find. I just wanted to say one thing, and this is a point that I was making earlier. Who comes to find answers in science? And this, where I want to talk a little bit about what is it about science that makes it so, that makes people turn to it for answers. I remember meeting this woman, one very wonderful metallurgist, who was a German Jew who was in the camps and who had to run away and came to Canada, became a Canadian citizen and a well-known metallurgist. And she was a very good science studies scholar. She passed away in 2016, Ursula Franklin. And when I met her, this incident stayed in my head. She said that as a child, she decided to study science because when she was in Berlin and she was studying physics and chemistry, she said the first time I encountered laws of nature, Newton's laws of motion, actually, is what she spoke about. The first time I encountered those, I was very happy because here was something that even Hitler could not change. Right? Here was some explanation of the world that even Hitler could not change. And this gave her so much strength that she wanted to study science, and that's how she came into science. And I think that this, if you look at the history of modern science, you see the times in which it emerges, you see what it challenges in its emergence. It actually tells us what was the fact that you're doing a materialistic study of the world at large. The world at large is very huge. Its dimensions are beyond our imagination. So we are trying to do a study using materialistic tools of this world, which is not really visible and sensorially possible for us to feel. We cannot feel it and we cannot see it. And yet we study it, and not in abstraction. We don't study it only in thought, like in philosophy. We don't study it, we are making conjectures, but we're not making theories without a material basis. There are other traditions that do this, but science is the tradition that actually tries to follow a certain path, that follows a certain process, method, whatever you may call it, in trying to answer these questions. Right? That does not mean it gets everything right. It does not mean it does things right. It actually, because of the fact that how much you know determines what question you will ask, even in science. How much you have access to determines how you will proceed with the answers. So, for example, if I know I have only apparatus that can measure distances up to, say, thousands of kilometers. Now, whatever those apparatuses are, or whatever those methods are, I cannot look at the world beyond those thousands of kilometers. If I have to look at the world beyond the solar system, if I have to look at the world beyond our galaxy, if I have to look at the world beyond everything, then I need methods and techniques to be able to measure and study beyond this. So only when those methods and techniques become available that I'm able to study beyond. Right? So science is very, very, and this is where the dissonance comes in. That if you talk to a scientist, they'll tell you that science never says that it knows the truth. Whereas when we listen to what science is told to us, when we study science, everything comes in its finished form. Everything comes as if this is a law that this man made, and this is something that came to us, and it is written in stone, and it cannot be questioned. It is this perception of science and the hidden understanding within science that no theory of science is ever complete. It will get rectified, it will get changed, it will get modified, we will know that this is the limit within which it can be applied. This is the only narrow way in which it can be applied. It can be thrown out of the window. It can, many things can happen. So there is also a dissonance between science as it is made and what in science education we usually call it as what is given to us is the final product. The process is never talked. If we talked about the process, we would have talked about who was this person Newton? Why did he come to this question? And why did he find this answer this time? Why wasn't there anybody else who could find that answer? If we were talking about the process, we would have asked many more questions. Why are all these guys after whom all these laws are named in physics, why are all of them men? Why are all of them nobility? Why are they all of them in a certain part of the globe? These are questions that would automatically get asked and answered. Because we're not interested in the process of when we are communicating, we don't talk about the process. We only talk about the final results. We teach only the final results, that many of us carry these notions of what is being purposefully given to us. That this is the, this is the final line and you have to follow it. So I think that when we start critiquing, we appreciate what it has to give while looking at the limits. The final thing that I would like to say is that many practicing scientists tell us that this is the problem of practice. Real science is not like that. And we keep on arguing with them that what is this real science? There is no real science. Science is what is practiced. There is no ideal somewhere which anyone has ever done. Because if you keep projecting that if done properly, then this is what will happen, it can never be done properly. So this is a running after a dream which cannot be achieved. That is not the goal. The goal is, and which we will talk more, the goal is to actually locate ourselves in the critique and talk about science also within the critique. That's the goal. The goal has to be that the process has to be made transparent. The process has to include questions about who is doing, how are they doing, why are they doing, when are they doing, where are they doing. All of these are important questions to understand any scientific concept. And if you pause and think about the pandemic, if you pause and think about the coronavirus, you will have a clear idea of all these questions were being asked. Whether they're being answered or not is a separate question. but they were all being asked, how did we come to know so soon? How did the vaccine come so soon? How did, who are these pharmaceutical agents, companies that are actually promoting the vaccine? Is there some international racket that is going on? All of these questions are valid questions of science, not of society. They're questions of science. So with that, I come to the part that I'm going to take a break. Does anybody have any comment to make at this point? Any comment? Any question? So, if there's none, then we can move ahead. This fact of looking at science as something that is the truth has stayed for so long that even sociologists, and this my friend Geeta Chadha always talked, that sociologists use the method of science to study everything in society. The last thing they turned their attention to was science. And that too not because they felt that science is something that could be studied as a knowledge system that could be studied, but because there were pushes from the many movements, political movements, people's movements, that forced them to look at science. And these movements being the anti-war movements, and very relevant to talk about it today when we have such a horrifying war happening around us. So the anti-war movement, the pacifist movement, and if you remember, if you look at histories, the same people who were responsible for the nuclear warfare in the Second World War became the biggest pacifists later on. The person I spoke about, Ursula Franklin, who actually suffered so much because of the Nazi presence and the Nazi rule, she was an avowed anti-war person, a pacifist. Similarly, the environmental movements, which today we see in the form of the climate change. But from very early on, the environment movements which are asking questions of how much intervention are we going to make into nature? And what is this method of taking? In the local context in India, the Bhopal gas leak and the Narmada Bachao Andolan, these were very, very significant movements that asked questions of science and technology, that asked questions of, is this the way? Is this the way to actually interact with nature? And the third set of people that asked these questions were those who were working with women and health. Because women's bodies and the kind of things that were being done with women's bodies, the ways in which women's bodies were being understood, all of these were also questions that were being raised. So from all these movements, we came to questioning science. And what is it that we're questioning? So the subject of science is nature. And so when science studies nature, it actually defines for us what is natural. And I think what Shanthan did with you all last time tells you that natural is also not really natural. It is something that we are constructing. We are constructing from whichever angle and whichever lens we are looking at the world, we are constructing the natural. So all those things about the animal world and how we see it from our location of being these human beings, when we look at the animal world, when we are projecting the human world onto the animal world, we are using our lenses to look at that. We see what we think is how animals will behave. And then we say, see, this happens in the natural world, so it is true in the social world. This is sociobiology at its best, right? Which led to very huge, racist attacks on people, because it said that, see, this is how it is in nature. We have the biggest violence of capitalism that exists today, that says that might is right, or competition or survival of the fittest, right? This is something that we've kind of picked up. Everyone has picked up, because you have to look at when Darwin brought out survival of the fittest, what was the understanding? Can we talk of evolution without using these concepts of survival of the fittest or scarcity of resources? Can there be other ways of looking at it? And scholars have said that there are other ways of explaining evolution. This is not necessarily the model that needs to be used. But that model was important because survival of the fittest and competition is something that capitalism wants. So for capitalism to survive, survival of the fittest is the thing. How do we justify survival of the fittest? We show the animal world. We say, see, who survives there? The fittest survive there. And so it is natural that our economic system will be of survival of the fittest. And we just erase all questions of access, we erase questions of inequity, we erase questions of, ages of repression, ages of oppression, of caste, race, gender, ability, everything. So we erase all that and we talk in terms of the naturalized principle of survival of the fittest. At the same time, as a woman, if I am living in a society which completely believes that women are inferior, that men are superior, women are inferior, that if I live in a country where everybody believes that Brahmins are superior and everybody else is inferior, if I live in a country where everyone starts thinking that Hindus are superior, everyone else is less, then I also get troubled. These are notions that I want to find answers. And particularly when the difference is not only cultural, when the difference is also biological, especially for people with disabilities, for queer and trans people, for women, we try to find out if it is about the body or it is not. Is it the body that is limiting us or is it only society? And that this either or question goes on in our mind. And that's why we keep going back to science also. Does science have any answers for us? Does science tell us whether, this is natural or not? We went to science for such answers. And so I say that this definition of the natural is the most critical part of science. That it actually defines for us what is natural, that natural is made normal by cultural processes. And we have to keep this distinction alive in our mind all the time, that there is a process of naturalization, and then that naturalization leads to normalization. And these two co-constitute each other. So what is normal in society is seen as natural, is proven as natural by taking other examples from nature. And then because it is natural, the normal is validated. So this play between the natural and the normal that science does is something that we need to understand. So now I would like to go from here directly into trying to see how gender, when I'm looking at only gender, up till now I'm talking about general things. When I'm looking at gender in particular, I also feel that over the years from 1980 to 2020, our understanding of gender has also shifted. And so I want to take this time to look at, without feminism, in pre-feminist times or pre-modern feminism times, what is the understanding of gender? And hence, what is the understanding of science? In early feminism, how did sex and gender get defined? How did gender get understood? And hence, how did science get redefined? And then, how do we look at it today? So in 3 phases, and I'll try and share my screen now. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yeah. Full screen. Can you quickly tell me how I make it full
It's
screen?
visible.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm saying, since I'm putting it as equations, that this is the understanding of gender that society has. And I write woman and man with capitalized letters because I mean cis woman and cis man here. My present understanding of woman is not only cis women. And so when I use regular spelling, I mean all women. But here I specifically mean cis woman. And instead of writing that, I'm just capitalizing a letter in that. So this is how we normatively understand that somebody is born with certain external genitals. They are female. That female genitals or the female body leads to that person becoming a woman. That woman is feminine. And this woman desires a man. Similarly, if you're born with a male body, then this man, masculine, desires a woman. So this is biologically determined and natural. There's nothing that you can do about it. If you're born a particular way, if you're born with a certain body, this is the woman you will become. And since you are a woman, you will get feminine characteristics. This is what is our initial understanding or the prevalent understanding in society. So with this understanding of gender, if this is the understanding of gender, this was the understanding of science also. That science is basically a mirror of nature. So science is something that's external. It comes, it shows us what nature looks like. The mirror is very critical because it is actually showing you this is how nature is. Again, in Western thought, nature is the passive object of study. It does not interact with this knower or this person who's coming to study. The knower is very distinct from nature, and hence, because the person who is studying or the process of studying is very separate from what we are studying, what is seen as passive, this knower is very distinct from nature. That's why the question of objectivity comes in. That you have to be objective. You have to be outside of this. You have to have a way to study in which that the subject does not influence you and you do not influence the subject. So this is how science was understood. The researcher is an objective explorer, very distinct from nature. I have to separate myself from nature if I have to study nature. And this is possible. This is what science tells us. It is possible to do this, and that is why, and this, one of the ways to do this is what we later on came to, that in the process what you're saying is because nature is feminine, science became masculine. That it is a masculine way of studying science. These were our initial ways in which we understood the gender, the science and nature divide. Right? So this is the usual understanding of science. When we go on to what happens when we change the meanings of gender. So when feminist equations came, we said that a female, we did not question female and male. We said a female body becomes a woman. Woman can have feminine or masculine characteristics. And this woman can desire a man or a woman. Similarly, a male body becomes a man, yes, but masculine and feminine characteristics are what is culturally determined. So somewhere in the feminist articulations, what we said was that sex is male and female. That is biologically determined. That is something that naturally comes to us. But gender is socially determined. It is cultural. And so what we broke one part of the equation. In the early feminist articulations, we broke one part of the equation. We said that the equation that a woman has to be feminine does not hold. There is no such thing as one person being feminine and another being masculine just because of the body that they have. You could be a mixture of all of these characteristics, and that is what feminism taught us. That is what many of us learned from feminism. So when we did this, then what was our gendered understanding of science now? That there can be no objective observer now. And why is this being said? Because when we looked at the masculine and the feminine, we also realized that what is happening here is that there is a divide, there's a binary, not only of the man and the woman, not only of the masculine and the feminine, but characteristics that were feminine and characteristics that were masculine were also posed as opposite to each other. And it is not just coincidental that all the masculine characteristics of objectivity, of reason, of public, of whatever, all of them actually were the characteristics that were being assigned to science. And all the characteristics that were being termed feminine were being assigned to nature. So this was the first contribution that feminist science studies scholars made. And they said that, because you're looking at the world like this, because in Western philosophy, nature is being seen as a feminine passive object, that the way of studying is becoming this masculine um, objective knower. And that it is not coincidental that then all the characteristics that are seen as masculine are valued more, all the characteristics that are seen as feminine are valued less, and they are assigned to nature and these are assigned to science. So somewhere then we were making a claim that there can be no objective observer. So from here, when we come with our understanding that feminine and masculine are messy categories, they're not separate, clean categories. Like Shantan showed you last time, that male and female are also not clean categories. Masculine and feminine, not at all clean categories. So when there is no real objectivity, so there is no objective observer, science then does not become a mirror. It is an interpretation. I make an interpretation of the world from where I am located. So actually, my knowledge is coming from where I am situated. And this is the contribution from somebody like Sandra Harding, who spoke of situated knowledges, that every knowledge has to be located. Every knowledge system is located, is situated, and even science is like that. And so we need to bring in that into our understanding of science. And hence now we say that science is actually like every other knowledge. It gives us partial truths, and partial truths because from my location I can only see this much. And that is Donna Haraway's contribution, that it is partial truths that you can see. But these were also questions in answer to a question that was raised by one of the earliest feminist science studies scholars, which is Evelyn Fox Keller, who was a molecular biologist and who actually wanted to study physics, could not, and went to molecular biology. And then she asked this question, that if all of these characteristics that are being seen as masculine are assigned to science, then what does the absence of women do to science? The question is not what women not coming to science does to women, but what does the exclusion do to science itself? That if you do not take so many points of view, if you do not take so many situations and locations from where knowledge can be generated, then what does it do to the knowledge that science produces? And I think that is the important question that got located when we spoke of gender like this. As we move on, and as Shantan has already spoken to you, that when we come to queer trans realities, when we come to present day feminisms, gender is a very complex phenomenon now. We're not looking at gender as only man, woman. We're looking at which woman, who woman, which man, what is the caste, what is the religion, how do these interplay with each other, how do caste, gender intersect, how do race, gender intersect. So this kind of an understanding of gender is where we are now. Over and above that, when we add in queer and trans voices, then we are saying that given the naturalness of the biological body is also being questioned from both the locations of trans people and from the location of persons with intersex variations. Persons with intersex variations are telling us what you saw through the animal world and you see through many other spaces, is that this clear categorization of this is a male body and this is a female body does not work. When children are born, they could have many variations in the body. All of us are different from each other. All of us are distinct from each other. This kind of forcing everybody into two boxes and very clean, tied two boxes without allowing for any interplay in between is not a possibility in nature. So people with intersex variations, we've ignored them, we've not talked about them, they live their lives without anybody knowing what their realities are and what their traumas are because of this hidden kind of violence that they face. But they told us that even at birth, even at birth, this putting one person into the male box and putting another person into the female box is something that is being done with a presumption of that this body is male and this body is female. And it is pertinent to also remember that, in the when you find out how do they decide who is the male body and who is the female body, it is interesting to see that there is this whole thing of looking at the penis size. When the infant is born, you stretch the penis and measure the size. And if the size is less than a certain amount, then that's a female. If it's more, then it's a male. Many times, people have small penises or people have large clitorises. And this creates the confusion in people's mind. So they've decided a size that anything that is less than that will be termed female, anything that is more than that will be termed male. And this size changes from nationality to nationality and cultures to cultures. And this is determined, this is there in medical knowledge, that, if for India, for example, it is something, I forget now, whatever it is, 2.5 centimeters or whatever it is. So you have to stretch it. If you find that this part of the body that is the penis, that can be the penis or that can be the clitoris, is looking longer than a clitoris but shorter than a penis, then this is what you do. And this is how you figure whether this child is female or male. Now, this itself creates immense confusion because there are also secondary characteristics that can come up, that at birth, though these characteristics are not the same, but somebody grows up and then finds that they have facial hair. Somebody grows up and finds later on that they never had a womb, they never had a uterus, they never menstruate. So many kinds of things can happen in human bodies. And all of those are intersex variations, which we are saying that there's no clear male and female body that should be drawn, that can be drawn, that ought to be drawn. But the urge to classify, the urge to see this world only in binaries pushes us into doing this. At the same time, if you look at trans lives, trans people are telling us that we are actually, that our lives are, that our bodies and our genders may not match, right? The assigned gender to them and whatever based on their body is not their gender. So they're articulating the gender. They are saying, I will decide what changes I want to make in my body. And so what my body looks like and what my gender is not a direct correlation anymore. That also questions our notion of sex and gender that we've divided so cleanly in the same kind of binary. The sex is biological, gender is cultural. That also gets broken. And this is what happens when we take queer trans articulations. Multiple genders. So you don't have only two, you have more than two. You've broken the binary. There's no correlation between body and gender. So you've broken the equation. There is no clear sex and clear gender. There is no clear natural and no clear cultural. Gender is not fixed. That I may change. So I may change, I may make some changes in my body, I may change my understanding of my gender may change. It may evolve. It does not necessarily have to be what was assigned to me. It is not something that I'm going to live with. And this shifts a lot about the natural location of gender in the body. This also shifts that. It should not be assigned. So you should never say that this person is this just by looking at them. It's best to ask people. It's best to ask people what is their gender. If we don't need to know their gender, actually, what we need to know is how do we address them, because our language is so gendered. If we don't even do that, it's fine. I don't need to know your gender. There's absolutely no need for me to decide what gender you are before I start interacting with you. And so gender is self-determined. There's a complex interplay of body, cultural markers, and materialities. I'm not saying that it's all imaginary. It is very much built. My gender expression, my gender behavior is built in the reality in which I survive. It is built in this world. So how gender is expressed in this world? If I see myself as a trans man, I will try and live like a man in this world for two reasons. One, my imagination is made by the understanding of who is a man in this world. Two, and more importantly, I think this works much more. I want the world to read me as a man, because this world is constantly reading. It's constantly reading and ascribing gender. So I want to be read as a man. And so I will make my appearance, I will make my body, I will make the visible parts of my body at least such that I will be read as a man. And so it is located in the body. I will decide what changes I want to make in my body. The body is important to my understanding of my gender, but it is not important in the sense that this body will become this gender. And I think that difference has to be understood. It is a material difference. It matters to me. What my gender is not only in my head, it is located in my body. And what will that look like? What will my body look like, and what will my gender look like, and how will I play it in life is also my subjective reality. There's no clear classification that all trans men will be like this. There's no clear classification all trans women will be like this. Like there is no clear classification that all cis men will be like this and all cis women will be like this. This is what we are learning from the present understanding of gender. Gender, sex, sexuality, call what you may, which is coming to us, to our feminisms today. And now then, if this is what it is, if the body and its expression, the biological and the cultural are so enmeshed with each other, then how do we now articulate science? How do we now talk about science? That's what we want to look at. So what I was saying earlier, that now these opposite binaries are not opposite anymore. They become hyphenated. Sex, gender, they link to each other. I cannot separate them from each other. I cannot say that they are binary opposites. The body, mind. No, gender is in my mind, gender is in my body. This is not two different things. That my body is this, but my mind says this. It is not like that. It is connected to each other, and nature and culture also get connected to each other. So all that was divided on the basis of this. Nature is one, culture is another, body is one, mind is another, sex is one, gender is another. All of these opposites, and they're all opposites, mind you, in Western philosophy. This is what we are learning. This is what science is teaching us. What we are saying is that they are hyphenated, which means that they cannot be separated. They are not the same. They are codependent, co-constituted. They are connected to each other. And I think that is a very important contribution now, to then look at science. So automatically, then these disciplinary divides between science, social science, humanities have to go. When I said that we teach science in this manner, if we taught science with the process, then all of these questions will become part of our understanding of science. And it's important whether I'm doing high quality research, whether I'm doing very, very specific research, I need to bring in my location into how I'm coming to this question. It is then questioning what is science, and it is compelling us to see that knowing, that is epistemology, and being, ontology, are not separate from each other. They are connected to each other, and they have to be understood like that. I think that this is a very different way of understanding science, that this is something that science studies, feminist science studies scholars have been trying to articulate. It is with a different understanding of science that we are coming to, of feminism, that we are coming to a better articulation of what we, at least I can say for myself, that struggling with this articulation, when I come to a queer feminist understanding, it helps me articulate it better. So now I'm not worried about how are you going to represent, how do you understand queer bodies, black bodies, brown bodies. That is not my question. I am undoing it. I'm questioning your assumptions. That is the main thing. I'm questioning the assumptions on the basis of which you're making this separation. And in reality, how does it work? Is that I will start looking at every practice in science. And since I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, I look at how am I teaching science? How can I teach it differently so that we can actually, we can bring in some of this into our understanding of science. That we don't want our understanding of science to be so limited to just saying that, okay, I go to the lab, I do this experiment, some X person, some noble white lord from whenever had done this experiment like this, I repeat the experiment, and that is how I learn about the phenomena. That is not how I want to teach. I want to teach about what is it that led to this discovery at that time. And as important is that part as it is to tell what the phenomena, as it is understood in that context, is. And the nitty-gritty of that phenomena, I want to teach that. Of course, I want to teach that. But I want to teach it in a contextualized manner. And this is something that's not happening. Now, this I can say as an educator, as a teacher. Other people, when they're doing the science, they're talking about how the science is being done differently. How are they thinking of questions differently? How are they asking questions differently? And how are they designing experiments differently? I think these are important contributions that are coming as people are bringing in their politics into science. Instead of hiding the politics, taking the stance of the status quo and doing the science. I think that that's a difference. It's not as if people have not brought their politics in, but the politics that was brought in for so long was status quoist, which actually replicated or took the view of the world that existed, the dominant view of the world that existed, to look at nature. Now we are saying that we come with an awareness. This is what we call strong objectivity in Sandra Harding's terms. This is strong objectivity. I'm not giving up on objectivity. No scholar of any subject gives up on objectivity. I don't think any sociologist would claim that I'm not objective, right? You are defining objectivity differently. You're saying that, yes, finally, when I speak of the knowledge that is generated from my study, my process has to be objective, but that does not mean that I am not a subjective knower. I am a subjective pursuer of that process. I'm a person who is doing this, and so who am I, and where am I located, and what is the context in which I'm asking these questions or designing this experiment is very important to what comes out of the study. That is strong objectivity. And we need to say it. I think if you're looking at science today, it is big science. We don't have that notion of that individual noble lord who was sitting in his castle and doing experiments and discovering things, or all those various stories that we've heard, which is a way to put us off science. It is a way to tell us that only geniuses can do science. It is a way to tell us that if you're not that kind of a person who can find that kind of time and space, you cannot do science. If that is not the purpose, if knowing about the world is something that every person is interested in, and if I can get the tools to know about the world in multiple ways, I should learn to use those tools in multiple ways. I should learn how to use them differently. So what we are saying now is that this subjective knower is coming to understand the world differently. And so when I say science is gender, we began with saying that no, science is not gender. Science is objective. Science does not carry this gender vendor with it. It is not part of the story of science because it is not connected to culture at all. That first broke down when we said, no, it is connected to culture. Because all that you're calling the traits of good scientists are actually masculine traits. How did this happen? How did all masculine traits get assigned to a scientist or science, and all feminine traits get assigned to nature? So this was our first question. Then we move on from there to today saying that gender, so then it is not only gendered in terms of excluding some people, it is gendered in the way that it looks at nature. And now further we are saying it is gendered in every which sense, because today our understanding of gender says that you cannot do these binaries. You have to see them as connected categories. So if science is being practiced as in this binary mode, then definitely it is gendered, but there's no harm in it being gendered, because if it is gendered in this understanding that we see the connection between science, culture, between science and nature, between my culture and nature, then we are doing gendered science, and there's no harm in doing gendered science. But what is that understanding of gender is the critical question. And whether in the present, in this understanding of science, one would say that a gendered practice of science is actually a more evolved practice of science. Right? Because if I don't do an aware gendered practice of science, then what I'm doing is a masculinist practice of science, which is gendered in a very different way. I'll pause here and take any questions that you might have. Anyone? Comments, questions? Yeah. Nivedita?
Go ahead, Nivedita.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you so much for this very enriching session. It was very informative. And I just wanted to ask about, we discussed how certain groups, and definitely the majority of the population is kept out from science. So how and when will science be able to make space for them, especially when so many of them do not have access to the so-called formal education necessary for science?
Anyone else who should answer that? Okay, so Nivedita, I don't have a clear, simple answer for this. But I do think that what is access to science is a question that I, as an educator, I keep highlighting. Why do I need to study science? I don't want, I mean, yes, it would be lovely if more people could get into formal research. But to go there is a path that has been decided. Whether I want to get into this pipeline itself, that's the question a lot of feminists had asked at one point. That you find women at lower levels, and as you go to higher levels, then you don't find the women there. So the question was of the leaky pipeline is one way that it was understood. And some people said that the pipeline itself is faulty, right? So if I have to actually be inclusive, I have to alter many things. I have to take the simple example of I am still struggling and I do not know how practicals, which are so dependent on eyesight, which are so how are those to be done with students or with people who don't have eyesight, who are blind? How do we do these experiments? And if I don't do these experiments, what do I do instead? Because it's not possible to do it, and it is very important in my study of physics or in my study of biology to see. Seeing is given so much importance. Seeing either with my eyes or seeing in multiple ways. Seeing through infrared, through X-rays, through this, that, and the other. Seeing is very critical to my practice of science. I do not even know how to do an alternative. So I have to find that out. I will have to look at other materialistic methods of understanding nature to be able to make this more open, to be able to, and that's why I insist on the fact that education will have to change. How we teach will have to change. We are not all, I taught in a regular BSc course in one college here, where most of my students were first generation learners. Maybe in so many years of teaching, maybe a few, say some 10, 12 of them continued with research in physics. I must have taught thousands of students. So what did they get out of that course? Those 10 maybe became physicists. They got something out of that course which helped them become that research scientist. What did the others get? Is also a question that I want to ask, because what is doing science? One is doing research and making a difference to how we understand the world. Second is also creating an aware public who can ask the right questions, who can, and I really felt this very strongly during the pandemic. It was a time when we could have done this process of, what are the limits of science? There is a limit within which you can take science. And it was playing out around us all the time. But we didn't have the language to have that conversation. We either say, oh, science is useless because today it says this, tomorrow it says this, day after it says this. Or we say science is controlled by pharmaceuticals. All of these are realities. All of these are real statements. And there's no denying that. But beyond this, how are we going to have a conversation so that we understand what we need to take from here and what we need to take from there? So an aware public is also very important. An aware public that can ask questions of the people. There are smaller things that people do, that, very, very small things that you put, who is funding your project? Please write it in your paper. Please write who is funding this project, because it's very critical. I mean, all our research in high energy physics that has become, that's supposed to be the highest kind of physics, the most abstract kind of physics, the most mathematical kind of physics that you do, it's all been funded by DST, right? By the defense ministries. Why did nuclear physics get such a boost in the 40s? It got a boost because of the nuclear power and nuclear bombs. So now, if today I want something else to get a boost, there has to be a public voice as well. And I think that is also critical to include people. So science education definitely has to change. The way we talk of doing science has to change. People who are teaching science are not considered to be doing science. Only the ones who are doing research in the laboratories are seen as doing science. And there too, it is like a usual career thing. How many papers you publish, what kind of citations you have. This method will not allow people who are, the praxis is so centered around these Brahminical networks that there's no way that others can get it. So a lot has to change to be able to do that. One of the ways is always that if you have more numbers, you can ask more questions. There is a critical mass that is necessary from within to ask the questions. So yes, all efforts to get more and more people in, but those people who come in also, and I speak for women in particular, I'm not speaking for other communities. I don't think getting women in just as women makes a difference. Because if I'm trying to prove myself there, I use the game as much as everybody else. I have to also bring some ideologies in. Unless those ideologies come in, praxis does not change. I don't know if I've answered you, but I do think that a lot has to change to actually make it really accessible to everybody. Numbers can come in, access can be given in terms of numbers. That does not really change much. But changing the processes of various kinds, and there are many efforts. There are efforts from within by women scientists, by queer people in science who have started talking about praxis, who started talking about, all these questions that we are raising here, what Shanthan raised, what I'm raising, other people are raising. Now we found the space to talk inside the science communities as well. For a long time, we were talking only to the humanities communities. We're now finding space within the science community. So we hope that makes a difference. That makes a difference in what we do and how we expand the meaning of access. Because, we've learned from reservations, we've learned from everything. Just getting people in does not mean anything. To change a lot of things to do that accommodation. And that is what we are at very, very elementary steps in science.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Anyone else?
Are there any more questions or comments? Rose, could you check the YouTube if anyone's posted anything on YouTube where we're live streaming? Okay. So this is just a comment, Chayanika. I mean, you must have also observed these things. In the last few years, we've seen like those who speak from obviously the perspective and politics of rationality and questioning the way in which we're seeing also blind faith and superstition, and related to that casteism and a communal way of thinking spread. So, we've had people, prolific writers, philosophers, even those coming out of the popular science movement, who've been viciously attacked. And, we've seen so many assassinations in 2015. And, so it's, just your comments on how the popular science movement or even movements have, thrown up voices and thinkers who have pushed for, rationality, inclusion, rising out of, lifting people's thinking and imagination out of superstition, and what those experiences have been like. I mean, in terms of a kind of a broad historical sketch, some of the important voices or people
Sure.
or movements.
So actually, this is there was this very, very strong strand of the people science movements, which was um, in the 80s in Bombay and Maharashtra, which was very active, and it continues till date as the Andhashraddha Nirmulan Samiti and the uh, Gyan Vigyan Samitis of various kinds. And, so the parallel movements in Kerala and West Bengal. And they're very, very coming from this notion of the earlier notions that India also had of getting scientific temper, because that will help us get rid of a lot of superstition, um, blind faith, all the things that you mentioned, Maya. So there was this thing that if you learn science, then you will actually be able to go beyond these things, because you will get a way of looking at the world which will help you address some of these questions, or get over some of these things that were seen as backwardness and traditional difficulties in moving forward. Uh, I'm using a lot of quotation air quotes because each of these can lead to a whole debate on whether that is really backwardness, what does it mean, etc., and whether reason is the only way in which that can be conquered, right? Or whether that was the path that allowed for it to happen. But in today's times, definitely, worldwide, there is a growing anti-science feeling, and that's why I spend so much time talking about, what is it in science that we go back to, and while we're critiquing not as anti-science people, we're critiquing as people who understand that reason, rationality, this method, materialistic method of understanding the world, is an important contribution to our present day realities. Uh, so we that's why I'm locating it there. I have been part of movements that have spent a lot of time trying to work towards making science accessible to people. And when they meant science accessible to people, they meant these, that you actually do these experiments, you make them simple, you make them accessible, you show how what that Baba does is actually a sleight of hand, you actually do it and show. So you do all of these things, you actually take people to do water testing, you take people to do air testing, you get them involved in methods of science so that they have answers that are located in science and not in, especially in health also. That you don't believe in the Devi's Prakop because of which you got smallpox. You don't believe in some beating of claps, thali bajana and lamp bujhana to get rid of the coronavirus, right? So you are wanting to teach people that. You are wanting to tell people that, but you see what the world is. You see what happened when these demands were made. You see how people cooperated. You see how educated people who were educated in school science went and did that. They're educated people who so in a sense, we've not achieved the dream. And maybe the dream needs to be remodified. That's why I keep coming back to, that we have to move it differently. But yes, the climate today is very anti-science. The climate today is very, and it is using some of our language of critique to hit back at science itself. So as is the case, those of us who are in science and critical of science, right? We're not giving up on science, we're keeping science, but also looking at it critically, our positions are always shaky. And some of these people who are attacked primarily for that. The people like Dabholkar, Narendra Dabholkar in Maharashtra, he was one of the pioneers of the Andhashraddha Nirmulan Samiti. He went around talking against Hindutva because he believed that a rational way of looking at the world is necessary. That this is what Hindutva is bringing along with everything else, is bringing a very fundamentalist way of understanding, a very essentialist way of understanding the world, a way of understanding the world which is not reasonable. And hence, he emphasized reason, he emphasized practices, he emphasized action against practices that encouraged, Andhashraddha. So he was killed. Then there was Pansare who was killed. Pansare spoke a lot about Shivaji. He, spoke about Shivaji very differently. He spoke about the times of Shivaji very differently. And he brought in a whole thing on, again, reason in a very different way. So you look at history in a reasonable manner. You look at what we know and bring that knowledge here. That also is a scientific method of doing things, a reasoned method of doing things. He was killed. Then there's Kalburgi in Karnataka, and of course Gauri Lankesh. And all these four, in some sense, are not actually, they are not actually Western, but they're very, very centered in the local realities, very centered in the local cultures, and yet questioning these strands within the local cultures. And and in the process of doing that, obviously they were critical of the voices of Hindutva that were inculcating these cultures, right? So that is how they got attacked and they got killed. And so I think that across the world, I mean, if you look at Trump, if you look at anybody, it is this whole thing of, it is a very anti-reason and rational atmosphere in which we are living. So I think no better way to explain it than 22nd of March 2020. So I think I remember I was just lying down and suddenly I woke up because there were these thalis being beaten all around where I live. And it was shocking. It was shocking. I never thought that everybody is going to beat the thali. It's just, that tells you where we are. But
Jessica, I think we can move to the vote of thanks.
Julian, you can take over with the vote of thanks.
I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Chayanika Shah for taking out time and enlightening us with her knowledge. I would also like to express my gratitude to our convener, Dr. Maya John, and other WSC staff advisors. Thank you to the audience for joining in today.
Thank you.
ma'am.
Thank you. Bye-bye.